Now, as the name of the video implies, this is the 14th and final part of a story, so if you haven't seen all or any of the previous parts, I'd recommend starting at part 1 or catching up, or this likely isn't going to make much sense to you. Links to all previous parts will be in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's finish this story. We pick up right where we left off, in the Senate building on Coruscant, where Erba Skywalker is charging at her father Luke, her crimson red saber blazing. And we watch as Luke quickly yet almost casually takes hold of his own saber, ignites the green-bladed weapon, and then easily sidesteps her first reckless attack, before blocking the second one that was aimed right for his head. So much anger in you, Luke begins while maintaining the block of her saber. But so much compassion as well. You care for him a great deal. You want to save him, and yet, more than anything, you want to feel worthy of him, of being his apprentice. With his saber then, Luke pushes hers away and causes her to stumble back a step or two. Luke then takes a step back himself, deactivates his saber, lowers it to his side, and says, "You are no Sith, and never will be. Even if you strike me down, you will not become what he wants you to be." For a few long seconds then, Erba just glares at Luke, while he just stands there calmly, the expression on his face one of understanding and concern. Erba then, after a few more moments with her eyes full of hate and anger, lets her shoulders slump a bit and says, "I was never given another choice." Luke takes a step forward towards her and replies, "I know, and the fault for that is mine. I should have known you were out there. I should have listened to the words of your mother. But I was blinded and let my obsession with destroying Vader nearly destroy me, as you're letting your obsession to save him destroy you now." "There is still good in him," Erba snaps back quickly, now lowering her saber. Luke gives a very soft sigh and says, "Yes, but it will not matter unless he is given a reason to embrace the light once more." That's when, just barely, we can see a spark of hope light in Erba's eyes as she says, "Do you think he can still be saved?" Though there is some degree of uncertainty upon Luke's face, he reaches out a hand towards her and says, "I don't know, but together we can try." That's when the scene then shifts, and we find ourselves with Ben and Rey as they race through the hallways of the Senate building when suddenly Ben slows down and comes to a halt. He then stares ahead for a few seconds towards what is no doubt the office of his mother, but he then looks over his shoulder, back from where they came, to where Luke still is. "What is it? What's wrong?" a confused Rey then asks. Ben takes her hand and looks into her eyes and says, "I have to go back." But to that, Rey vehemently shakes her head and says, "No, this isn't your fight. You'll be killed." Ben squeezes her hand and says, with a solemn expression upon his face, "This has always been my fight." Rey then shakes her head again. "I won't let you do this. I won't let you leave me." But now it's Ben who shakes his head as he says, "I'm not leaving you. I couldn't even if I wanted to. You and I were linked somehow. We felt it since the moment we met. Not to mention, Luke said in all the realities he'd seen that one of us always destroys the other. But that won't happen this time. This time, we've saved each other, as we were always meant to. And when this is all over, we can just go be together somewhere. But it can't end till I play my part." Rey immediately then responds, "Play your part? Ben, you're making no sense." Ben then averts his gaze just a bit and says, almost looking ashamed, "There is a darkness inside of me, Rey. It's always been there. And it's the reason Luke wouldn't train me, because he thought my destiny was to one day become something horrible. But it isn't." Ben now looks into her eyes as he continues, "My destiny was to find you, to find the light that would counter the darkness within me, the darkness I must now embrace, if this is to ever truly end." Rey, the expression on her face completely lost, shakes her head and looks for words to argue against him, but before she can, Ben says, "I know what I have to do. Somehow, I just know." Again, it looks like Rey wants to say something, but Ben wraps her in his arms, kisses the top of her head quickly, and then pulls away and begins to head down the hallway back towards Luke. After only a few steps, he stops, turns, and says, "My mother's office. It isn't far ahead. It's room 327. Please find my parents. Get them out of here." And with that said, Ben turns around and just runs off again. Rey frowns and then grumbles to herself something about how she of all people is supposed to save Han Solo and Princess Leia. Her frown then grows even more and she says, almost as if coming to a decision, "If any two people in this galaxy can take care of themselves, it's them." And then while staring off down the hallway, where Ben has just disappeared around a corner, she says, "But you, Ben, you're going to need me. That's my destiny. And with that said, she takes off down the hall after him. We then switch scenes and find ourselves in space above Coruscant, where the battle rages on against the Imperial fleet, but is now being led by the Chiss fleet that has just recently arrived and is positioning itself between what's left of the New Republic and Mandalorian fleets that were almost entirely obliterated by the attacking Imperials. We then are taken to the bridge of one of the ships and see Thrawn standing at a view screen calmly watching as the battle unfolds, one hand placed behind his back. And though at first all we see on the bridge is nothing but Chiss officers, it is a human, maybe in his 60s, who suddenly comes to stand beside Thrawn. And to him, Thrawn says, "Commodore Vanto, status report." Vanto then says, "As you predicted, Imperial tactics haven't changed much, and we've been very much able to use that to our advantage. Soon enough, absolute victory will be ours, and losses will be minimum." Thrawn gives an approving nod of the head and then says, "This day will go a long way in achieving our goal of bringing peace to the whole of the galaxy." Vanto glances at Thrawn out of the corner of his eyes and then says, "A peace that will be needed if this galaxy has any hope of defeating what is coming." Thrawn says nothing to that, and instead continues to just watch the battle unfold. We then switch scenes and find ourselves back in the Senate building with Luke and Erba, and see that Luke still has his hand out to her. After a few long moments of contemplation then, Erba begins to reach for it, which is when we hear the voice of Darth Vader echo all around them and say, "The Force is strong with you, Darth Ison. A powerful Sith and worthy apprentice you will be when you destroy Skywalker." Upon hearing this, Erba pulls her hand back and stumbles away from Luke a few paces, and Luke only looks at her with sadness upon his face as he leaves his hand stretched out to her. Erba, her face riddled with a million different emotions, then stares at the hand of Luke Skywalker for a long moment before she looks into Luke's eyes, but soon enough, as if seeing the look upon his face is too painful, she falls to her knees, shuts her eyes and lowers her head, and a few seconds later, when her eyes again open, there is a dark resolve there, and she raises her head and looks upon Darth Vader, who, from their flank, has just emerged out from behind one of the crushed trooper monstrosities. And as usual, he does not wear his helmet, but only a breathing apparatus over his mouth and nose. And with his eyes focused upon his son, Vader begins to slowly stride towards them, and that's when Luke quietly says down to Erba, "Our only hope to save him is to give him a reason to come back to the light." For one fleeting moment then, Erba turns her gaze upon Luke, but what if any message she tried to send him with her eyes is impossible for us to tell. Luke then turns to face Vader, and he again activates his green saber and lifts it in a defensive posture as he stares his approaching father down with eyes that show nothing but a calm, confident resolve. But that's when we hear another voice come from behind Luke. "Master Skywalker, how good it is to see you again." Slowly then, Luke turns his head and sees behind him his former apprentice Rad, who we also know as Snoke. Snoke then says as he slowly approaches, "Unfortunately for you, your deception has failed, and I remember my true place and purpose. And soon, with the help of your father, I shall be master of all things." Luke then turns his head back around to look at Vader and says, "What exactly did he tell you? What's he promised you?" Luke flashes a grin and then says, "Whatever it is, you can't trust him." Snoke then stops his slow approach and says, causing Luke to once again turn and look at him, "Of course he can't trust me, but he has no other choice. Death soon awaits him. Nothing can stop that now. And for the chance to see his precious Padme one more time, to change her fate and his own, there is no risk he won't take, nothing he won't sacrifice." Briefly after hearing that, Erba looks upon Luke once more, and while Luke is still switching his gaze from Snoke back to Vader, he manages to catch her look, and they make brief eye contact, but nothing more. Luke then says to Vader, "You don't even begin to understand what you're doing. I was taught much about the world between worlds from one who used to rule over it. Changing things never brings about the desired results. It's an endless loop of trying to put one thing right while another falls apart. Time is no different than the Force, Father. Trying to shape it to your own will only brings about pain and suffering. You above all people should know that." Vader, having stopped short of Luke by several paces, then says, "You can accept your destiny if you want, my son, but I will not. Your Jedi have been all but wiped out, and when you two are destroyed, the power of the dark side will be absolute, and nothing will stop me from entering the world between worlds and rewriting the past." Luke, looking down at Erba then, who refuses to meet his gaze, then says to Vader, "And when you change the past, Father, you'll wipe out all that has come since. You'll erase all that you care about." Vader, his eyes suddenly filling with anger, then responds, "The only thing I have ever cared about was taken from me, and when I am done, I shall have her back." But to that, Luke shakes his head and says, "But you won't. Your younger self will have her back, for a time at least. But he too will likely make mistakes and lose her. Such is the way of things. The harder one tries to fix or prevent something that is destined to be, the more likely they are to help bring it about." Luke then lowers his saber and takes a step towards Vader. The expression on his face is pleading and almost hopeful as he says, "I know how you felt of the dark side, Father. I saw glimpses of it while I was in the world between worlds. You wanted to save her, to save my mother, but your obsession with trying to save her is what led to her death." Luke takes another step forward and says, "Remember your Jedi training. Remember what Obi-Wan taught you. The Force flows through us. We are not meant to control it. It is meant to control us, to lead us to our true destiny. Fight that destiny and you will lose in the end every time." Vader, with an almost approving and admiring nod of the head, says, "Spoken like a true Jedi, my son. But I will not let the Force choose my destiny. Long ago I realized it is the Jedi who are the true evil in this galaxy. Those who have the power to shape things for the betterment of all, yet do not act, are the true culprits behind disorder in the galaxy." Luke sighs when he hears that and takes a step back from Vader and again raises his saber. He then says, "The Jedi exist to maintain the balance. Without the dark, there can be no light. Such is the way of things, the way of the Force. From death comes new life. And it is not our place to control that cycle. It is only our place to ensure it transpires as it should." After hearing that, Vader looks away from Luke and down at Erba and says, "Apprentice, the time has come to prove yourself once and for all." Vader then opens one of his hands, and resting in the palm is one of the stones that was once a part of the portal to the world between worlds. Vader then says, "Once you have destroyed Skywalker, together we shall open a portal and change the past." Suddenly then, the stone begins to give off a soft golden glow, and an image takes shape within it. And in that image, we see Erba standing beside a much younger Anakin Skywalker. Vader then continues, "I have seen it, my apprentice. You serving loyally at my side, as together we bring lasting peace and order to the galaxy." Erba, transfixed by the image the stone gives off, opens her mouth to speak, but seems unable to form words, as the look upon her face becomes ever more overcome by joy. Vader then says, "It is hard to admit, but you have been right about me all this time, granddaughter. There is more I care about in this galaxy than just the love I lost so long ago. And if you truly want to save me, then destroying Skywalker and changing the past is the only way." Erba then, her eyes suddenly filled with determination, gets to her feet and looks at Luke. That's when Luke, his eyes focused on Vader, quickly says, "Why not just destroy me yourself, Father?" To that, Vader seems to have no answer, and it's then that the golden glow from the stone, and the image within, fades away as Luke again lowers his saber and takes a step or two towards Vader. Luke then says, still only looking at Vader, "I'll tell you why. If you strike me down, my daughter, you will spend the rest of your life regretting it and in pain, and this pain will lead to anger, and then the hate and the suffering will begin. But unlike him, this hate and suffering will not fuel your rage and make you powerful. It will destroy you, and for the rest of your life, you will be nothing more than his servant." Luke then deactivates his saber, tosses it away, and walks towards Erba with his arms open and says, "And that's because you are not like him. You're better than him. You're better than me. And your fate is to end all of this pain and suffering that has plagued our family, and to help bring a lasting balance to the Force." Before any of the three can say or do anything else, we hear a round of slow, mocking applause, and they all turn and see that Snoke, who'd been quietly observing the whole time, is the one giving the applause, as he very slowly walks towards Luke. Snoke then says, How very moving, Master Skywalker, but a lasting balance cannot be brought to the Force, not so long as I exist. Luke then gives a relenting nod of the head and says, "You're right, the Force can never truly be brought into balance as long as you exist, but you were never meant to exist. And if you'd been listening before, you would have heard me mention something about not being able to deny our destiny, and you too, my friend, have one that I foresaw when I was in the world between worlds." Snoke, a look of anger darkening his face, then says, "Destiny? Destiny has no hold over me. Strike me down and I shall return anew in time. My only destiny is to be forever known as the chosen of the dark side and to shape the destiny of others. And when I return to the world between worlds, I shall become..." But Snoke never finishes what he was about to say. Instead, there is now a white-bladed lightsaber protruding through his chest. A moment later, then, the saber is drawn back, and we watch as it swings and slices through his waist, cutting Snoke in half. And when the top half slides away from the bottom and goes crashing to the floor, we see standing behind him, with Ahsoka's white lightsaber in hand, was Ben Solo. "The dark side has chosen another," Ben says down to the two twitching halves of Snoke as he deactivates the saber. He then looks up and over at Luke, and Ben stares at his uncle with a cold look upon his face as he simply says, "He won't ever rise again." For a moment, Luke, Erba, and Vader all just stand there, their eyes locked on Ben. But while there is a look of shock on the face of Erba, and a look of something almost akin to admiration on the face of Vader, there is only a look of sadness upon Luke's face as he says, "Ben, this was the fate I was trying to save you from." Ben gives a single nod of the head and says, "I know, but it was the only way to end this. I had to embrace the darkness." Luke takes a few hasty steps towards Ben and says, "And now you must reject it." But to that, Ben shakes his head and says, "I can't. One cannot and should not reject the darkness. It is as much a part of the Force as the light." To that, Luke vehemently shakes his head and says, "Ben, you don't know what you're talking about." "But I do," Ben argues calmly, the expression on his face still cold and almost emotionless. "All my life I've been fascinated with the Force, with the Jedi and the Sith that they fight." Again, Luke vehemently shakes his head and says, "Ben, it's so much bigger than just that." "I know," Ben says again with a nod of the head. "I see that clearer than ever now. The Force is bigger than we could ever hope to understand." He then looks at Vader and says, "To shape it to our own will, one must sacrifice absolutely everything, both the things they love as well as their very being and essence. They must give themselves to it." Ben shifts his gaze to Luke and then says, "But the same holds true of the Jedi. To serve the Force, one must sacrifice absolutely everything, both the things they love as well as their very being and essence. One must surrender themselves to the Force." Ben then looks over his shoulder and sees that Rey is standing a few paces behind him, and for the first time since he killed Snoke, we see a trace of emotion upon his face as he gives her a faint smile and says, "The Force itself is always in balance, always finding a way to put things the way they need to be." He then turns back around and looks at Luke, Erba, and Vader in turn and says, "It is only us, we who are connected to each other through this balanced Force, comprised of light and dark, that create and carry imbalance within us, not the Force itself." Vader then takes a step forward and says while looking at Ben, "The Force is with you, young one, but you are not a master of it yet, nor is your wisdom as sound as you think it is, for balance, both within us and within the Force itself, is a fragile thing that can easily be broken." Immediately then, Vader raises a gloved hand and reaches out in the direction of Ben, but his target actually stands behind Ben, and through the Force, Vader takes hold of Rey, quickly lifts her off her feet, and snaps her neck before letting her just drop. Ben then spins around and races to catch Rey's lifeless body as it slumps to the floor, as a horrified Luke looks on and slowly, almost without thought or like he can't process what's just happened, moves towards Ben and the fallen Rey. Erba, looking stunned, has her eyes locked upon Vader, who just stands there coldly. Resting in his palm still is the stone that showed her a vision of her standing beside a younger Anakin, and when she turns her attention back towards it now, it again starts to give off a faint golden glow, one that Vader either doesn't notice or pays no attention to, and the ever so faint image within it is now of Ben Solo standing beside a younger Anakin Skywalker, which immediately causes the look on Erba's face to darken. Vader then says to Ben, as he begins to march forward and right past Erba without giving her so much as a glance, Now, young one, you begin to truly understand the nature and power of the dark side. Embrace your anger, embrace your hatred, and give in to your rage. It is then that Luke reaches Ben and lays a hesitant hand upon his shoulder. But Ben, as he cradles Rey's body in his arms, is quivering with anger, as tears of pain and loss stream unchecked down his face. And it is then that we see, clenched tightly in Ben's hand, is Ahsoka's saber. And as we focus in on it, we see several small cracks start to form in it. Luke then says, Ben, you have to fight this. You have to. But before Luke can finish what he was about to say, Ben releases a vengeful scream as he lets go of Rey's body, springs to his feet, and ignites Ahsoka's saber. But it is not a white blade that springs forth, but rather a crimson red one that sputters a bit and seems slightly unstable. Luke again tries to say something, but Ben raises a hand and unleashes a force blast that sends Luke flying backwards. He then charges at Vader, who only stands there completely unmoving. And when Ben is about to reach him, he raises his saber to strike the unflinching Vader down. But another red saber seems to come out of nowhere and blocks it. And that saber is of course being wielded by Darth Ison. With their sabers locked then, Ben looks into her eyes and says, "You would save him! You know you mean nothing to him!" Those words seem to sting her on some level, and she pushes his saber away and begins to attack Ben, who awkwardly manages to block her swings. It isn't long though before she disarms him and sends his saber flying, and Ben, as he tries to scramble backwards to escape her rapid attacks, trips over his own feet and goes crashing to the floor, landing on his back and finding himself looking up at the tip of a saber being pointed at his chest. Darth Ison seems to be about to plunge the saber forward when we hear Luke scream out, "Erba, no!" which causes her to hesitate. Luke then says, "Remember, you have to give him a reason." Erba then glances up at Vader, who now stands right over her. Vader then says, "Finish it, my apprentice, and earn your place at my side." A look of grim resolve then comes over her face, but a moment later it withers away, and she looks up and stares into Vader's eyes as she says, "I can't do it." Vader then, his eyes filled only with anger, says as he takes hold of his saber and ignites it, "Then I have no use for you." And as he raises his saber to strike Erba down, she only stares up at him with a pleading look in her eyes, which causes Vader to falter. And it's during these fleeting moments that we watch Ben reach out his hand towards Ahsoka's saber that has been sent not too far away when he got disarmed, and he pulls it to him through the Force. And without hesitation, once in his hand he ignites it, and from where he lies on the floor, he thrusts his saber upwards and pierces Vader in the side of the stomach with it. Vader then howls in pain as he instinctively clutches at his wound with the hand that had been holding the stone, and in the process, he drops the stone. Time seems to slow way down then, as it clatters to the floor, and Erba, Ben, and Vader all have their attention drawn to it. And all at once, the three of them all but dive for it, and almost simultaneously, they all try to wrap their hands around it. Which is when there is a flash, and suddenly we find ourselves in the world between worlds, where walkways seemingly made of light or energy wind their way through a dark, star-dotted eternity, and lead to various portals as far as the eye can see and well beyond. And in front of one of these portals, on his knees and clutching at a wound on his side, is Darth Vader. And the image through the portal he looks into is of a much younger version of himself, of Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala, sitting in a field on Naboo and having a picnic. And as we watch Vader, he tries to get to his feet, to head towards the portal, but fails and stumbles back to his knees. That's when we hear the voice of Erba come from just behind Vader and say, "She's beautiful." A moment later, also from behind Vader, we now hear the voice of Ben Solo say, "She is. The old holovids I'd seen her in, they don't do her justice." Vader then glances over his shoulder and says, "Help me save her then." We then focus in on the face of Ben, and the peaceful look that was there just a moment ago quickly morphs into one of anger. "Help you save her when you took Rey away from me?" Vader has nothing to say to that, and soon after he begins to crawl towards the portal. Ben looks like he wants to stop him, but Erba reaches out a hand and places it on Ben's chest, stopping him. Ben looks at the hand on his chest with anger, and then says to Erba, "We can't let him go through." Erba says back calmly, "He's not going to. Just let him have this moment before he dies." Erba then turns from Vader and begins to walk away, but Ben remains standing there and seems like he wants to go and stop him. But Erba then says to him, "Trust me, cousin, he won't go through, and we need to find a way to save Rey." Hearing that seems to make Ben instantly forget all about Vader, and he begins to follow Erba down the shimmering pathway that leads to a different portal. But soon he stops and says, "What's done is done. How would us changing the past make us any different than him?" Erba seems to rack her brain for a moment before saying, "What does the Force tell you?" Ben concentrates and then says, I can't feel the Force here. This place is beyond it somehow." Erba then says, "I can't feel it either, which means you're right. This place is something beyond it, something greater than it, perhaps." Ben thinks for a bit, then nods and says, "Luke said something about this being a dominion of the wills, of the beings that once watched over all things and recorded what transpired." Erba nods to that, then looks at the portal they're heading towards and says, "Perhaps if we let it, it'll lead us exactly where we need to go and show us what we need to do." Ben glances over his shoulder to where Vader is and is about to say something, but Erba quickly says, "He won't do it. You have to trust me. I know he won't do it. He just wants to look upon her one last time. And maybe when we put things right, we can get Rey back." To that, Ben seems to reluctantly nod his head in agreement, and the two again head for a portal dead ahead of them on the path. And when they reach it, they watch a series of events transpire, and though they confuse Erba and Ben, we recognize it all too well as the final confrontation between Luke, Vader, and Palpatine aboard the second Death Star. And we watch as Luke hides from Vader before his feelings betray him and Vader senses that Luke has a sister. We then watch as Luke embraces the dark side for a moment and lashes out against Vader, culminating in him cutting off Vader's hand before the Emperor tells him that he will now take his father's place at his side. And we and they continue to watch as Vader ultimately saves Luke in the end, saves his son from the wrath of the Emperor and destroys him, but dies in the process. The portal before them then goes dark, and Erba and Ben, who had watched the whole thing in silence, look at each other and both ask, "What was that?" Ben then says, "It makes no sense. Luke never went to the second Death Star. My mother, she convinced him to stay and helped them during the assault on the shield generator on Endor. And that's where Luke encountered Vader and nearly killed him." Erba shakes her head and says, "Clearly he wasn't supposed to stay. He was supposed to confront Vader on the Death Star and..." Erba lowers her head and then says, "And that was where Anakin was meant to come back to the light and die." Ben lays a comforting hand on Erba's shoulder and says, "But he did come back to the light. Luke brought him back to the light. That's what really matters here." Erba makes a bit of a helpless shrug with her shoulders and says, "No, none of this matters if Luke is going to be convinced not to go to the Death Star by your mother, not to face him and the Emperor like we just saw." Ben and Erba both fall silent, and a moment later, a new image takes shape out of the darkness beyond the portal. And now it's of the planet Endor at night, high atop the trees in an Ewok village where a roaring fire illuminates the inside of a giant hut, where an Ewok celebration seems to be taking place. Ben and Erba exchange a look and both shrug in confusion before they notice, sitting quietly amongst the celebrating Ewoks, is Luke Skywalker. They also quickly notice that Han, Leia, and the others are there as well. And that's when Ben reaches his hand out towards the portal, but Erba quickly takes hold of his arm and stops him. "What do you think you're doing?" she says. Ben, looking excited, says, "It's Endor. The portal is showing us the moment we need to change." Erba frowns and says, "That's great and all, but how exactly are we supposed to change it? By suddenly showing up out of nowhere and getting ourselves killed by a mob of Ewoks?" Ben thinks for a moment, then again reaches out his hand towards the portal, and before Erba can stop him, which she was about to, Ben asks her to trust him, and she gives him a frown and does nothing besides fold her arms and watch what Ben does. And that's when Ben puts his hand upon the threshold of the portal and says to Erba, "I can feel it. I can feel the Force." Erba gives a shrug and says, "That's great, but how's that supposed to help us?" Once again, Ben thinks for a long moment before simply saying, Luke, hear me." Erba rolls her eyes and seems to do all she can not to bust out laughing, and Luke doesn't seem to make any type of reaction to Ben's voice. Nevertheless, Luke does get to his feet and heads out of the giant hut and onto one of the outside walkways. The portal then shifts, and suddenly it is outside with Luke, and Ben and Erba see him in deep thought. Once again, Ben says, pushing his hand just a little bit across the threshold, Luke, hear me." At this point, Luke's head snaps up, and now from his perspective, we see a vague, shimmering blue image before him, roughly shaped like a person. And to this image, Luke says, "Ben? Ben, is that you?" Back on the other side of the portal now, Ben looks at Erba with a flabbergasted expression upon his face. He then looks back at Luke through the portal and says, Yes, it is me. It's Ben." Immediately Luke says, "I have to tell her the truth, Ben. I have to tell Leia about our father." And I'm going to face him, Ben, but not to kill him, but to save him. I have to try. Again on the other side of the portal, Ben looks at Erba with a flabbergasted expression. He then says to Luke back through the portal, Yes, Luke, you have to try. I understand. This seems to confuse Luke, and he says, But I thought you wanted me to destroy him. Erba then says, back on the other side of the portal again, That's enough, Ben. I think you got your message across. We don't want to confuse him. Ben ignores her and seems about to say more to Luke when Erba reaches for his hand to pull it back, but when she takes hold of it, the two have a very brief struggle before she's able to yank it back through the portal. While on the other side of the portal during this, from Luke's perspective, he sees the vague blue shimmering image take on the solid form of a person for the briefest of moments, and that person looks just like Padme Amidala. In the next moment then, still from Luke's perspective, the blue image completely disappears, and it's only seconds later that Leia comes out from the Ewok hut, and that's when Luke says to her, Leia, do you remember your mother, your real mother? Back in the world between worlds now, the portal has gone dark once more. Erba then says to Ben, So, do you think it worked? Ben shrugs, I don't know, we're still here. If it worked, I would think that maybe... Ben's voice then drifts away and Erba finishes, that maybe we would have faded away or something since we just destroyed our future? Ben nods but doesn't seem to want to say anything to that. Instead, he looks at the portal and says, It doesn't seem to have anything else to show us. Perhaps that's a good sign. Erba nods in agreement and says, What do we do now? Ben can only sigh before saying, I don't know. We didn't really think this all the way through, did we? Erba only gives a small, somewhat bitter chuckle in response. And it's then that, at the same moment, both turn their heads and look off down the path, to where they can just barely make out Vader now standing in front of the portal they left him at. But from even this great of a distance, they can tell it's not showing the same time and place it was before. It's not showing a picnic on Naboo, but rather something else. And as Ben and Erba race off towards it and get even closer, they can see that Vader now stands directly in front of the portal, and beyond it is a fiery, volcanic world. Ben then says as they run, You said he wouldn't go through! Erba then says back, I thought for sure he wouldn't. I thought... Ben, looking angry now, says, You thought wrong. Ben then glances at Erba and notices a slight smirk on her face. You knew he'd go through. I was a fool for trusting you. We're then looking through the portal from Darth Vader's perspective, and through it we see Obi-Wan Kenobi standing upon a rocky shoreline of a lava river on the planet Mustafar, while a young Anakin Skywalker stands on a platform hovering above the same lava river. That's when we hear Obi-Wan say, It's over, Anakin. I have the high ground. And it's at this moment that the wounded Darth Vader steps through the portal, as a helpless Erba Skywalker and Ben Solo reach it just in time to watch the portal close up behind him. Ben then looks at Erba and says, You knew. You helped him. Erba shakes her head and says, One way or the other, I wanted to save him. And now I have. And that is where this story ends. For now. Well, that's all I've got for you this time, and this is where I give a big thank you to everyone who has been following along with this story week in and week out, or to anyone who finds it somewhere down the road and listens to all 14 parts. I know this likely isn't the ending you expected, or that you might say this isn't an ending at all, but from the start I planned on having Vader win, and though I had a couple different versions of the ending I was trying to pick from, this is the one I ultimately went with. Now, do I have plans to continue this story somewhere down the road? Yes, but next up, I'm going to be taking my version of Episode 8, which I of course called The Lost Jedi, and putting it all together into one video instead of 5, as well as tweaking the story and some of the dialogue just a little bit. I also hope to add some new and better artwork, so if you have some artistic talent and want to help out on that front, please let me know. After that, I'll of course be then doing my version of Episode 9. Lastly here, if you enjoy my stories, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Even $1 a month gets you access to my Discord server where we're always talking some Star Wars. Anyway, for now, please leave your comments below and tell me what you thought either of this part of the story or the whole thing in general. And as always, thanks for watching.